If you've ever found yourself moved by the smallest act of kindness. If you believe that sometimes it doesn't take a miracle, just a quiet moment, a simple song or a gentle soul, to change someone's world, then you're in the right place. Here at Justice Reloaded HD, we bring you true heartwarming stories every single week, stories that remind us that healing doesn't always come from medicine, wealth, or fame. Sometimes, it comes from a voice, a lullaby, or someone who simply listens. So if this kind of story speaks to your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and join us on this journey of rediscovering hope in the most unexpected places. Because today's story begins with a quiet melody, and ends in a way no one could have ever imagined. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when billionaire Grant Remington stepped into a small, rustic diner on the corner of Pine Street and Honey Avenue in Spokane, Washington. Known for its maple waffles and homemade jam, the place was modest, nothing like the luxury Grant was used to. But he wasn't here for himself. Beside him was his 6-year-old son Mason, a little boy with tousled brown curls and eyes that rarely met another's gaze. Mason hadn't spoken in nearly 3 years. Diagnosed with a complex speech and language disorder, he communicated through gestures, distant stares, and the old cassette player he carried everywhere, an ancient device with a worn-out tape of lullabies his late mother used to sing. Grant walked him to the corner booth, the most secluded seat in the place, and carefully helped Mason into the vinyl seat. The boy immediately pressed the cassette to his ear, thumb hovering over the play button like it was his lifeline. He didn't look at the menu. He didn't look at his father. He just sat there, small and silent. Grant gave a tight smile to the waitress approaching them, muttered a polite order, then excused himself to the restroom, leaving Mason momentarily alone. At that exact moment, the diner's radio crackled with static. Then silence. The music stopped. To anyone else, it was barely noticeable. But to Mason, it was catastrophic. His little frame stiffened. He dropped the cassette player on the table and began to rock back and forth. His hands clamped over his ears as if trying to shut out the stillness. The absence of sound, of rhythm, of familiarity, was too much. A storm was rising inside him. Behind the counter, Sophie Lane had seen meltdowns before. She had no degree in special education, no fancy title, but she understood what it meant to feel unseen, overwhelmed, and alone. So she didn't panic. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't flood the moment with questions or sympathy. She simply walked over to the table next to Mason's and sat down without a word. Then softly, almost like a whisper, she began to sing. Musical note, "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine," musical note. Her voice was gentle, imperfect, real, like a warm blanket on a cold morning. She didn't look directly at him, just let the melody hang in the air between them, like a bridge waiting to be crossed. And then something happened. Mason stopped rocking. His hands slowly slipped down from his ears. His breathing steadied. He turned, eyes wide, not at the sound itself, but at the feeling behind it. For the first time that morning, he wasn't scared. He looked at Sophie, truly looked, his gaze locking onto hers like a thread being tied. Then, barely audible, a single syllable slipped from his lips, fragile, breathy, full of wonder. "Son." At that exact moment, Grant returned, wiping his hands with a paper towel. He froze as he stepped into view, eyes darting to his son. He saw the waitress sitting quietly, still humming. He saw Mason, his Mason, speaking. His heart stopped. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, breath caught in his throat, watching something unfold between his son and a stranger, a connection no therapist, no specialist, no amount of money had ever been able to spark. It was a moment carved in silence, carried by a song, and witnessed by a father whose entire world was shifting, note by note. The next morning, Sophie was restocking the sugar jars behind the counter when she noticed a familiar figure walk through the front door. It was early, before the usual breakfast rush, and the sunlight was just beginning to stretch across the floorboards of Pine and Honey. Grant Remington. But this time, he was alone.
No talertsud.
No assistant trailing behind. Just a simple charcoal sweater and slacks that looked almost too ordinary on a man whose name was usually attached to skyscrapers and Forbes lists. He didn't order anything. He didn't sit in the booth he had the day before. Instead, he walked up to the counter where Sophie stood, a touch of uncertainty in his usually confident stride. Without a word, he pulled a crisp business card from his pocket and laid it gently on the counter in front of her. Grant Remington. Founder, Remtech Holdings. Sophie blinked, unsure of what to say. She recognized the name, of course she did. His face had been on magazine covers. His company was behind some of the most advanced developments in AI and sustainable infrastructure. But here he was, standing in a modest diner like a man with no power at all. He took a breath, then pulled out his phone and tapped on the screen. "I want to show you something," he said quietly. The screen lit up with security footage, clearly from one of the diner's corner cameras. Sophie leaned forward. There was Mason. He was sitting in the same booth as yesterday, cradling his cassette player, just as before. Then, the radio went silent. Sophie watched herself walk into frame, sit at the next table, and begin to sing. She felt a strange shiver, watching her own movements, reliving a moment she hadn't realized was being recorded. Then it happened, Mason turning toward her, his lips parting, and whispering that single word. "Son." Grant paused the video. But instead of putting the phone away, he fast-forwarded. There was another clip, Mason again, this time at the tail end of their visit, as Sophie wiped down the table and hummed a few notes. He looked up at her and murmured, a bit louder this time. "Son, again." Grant looked up from the screen. His eyes were tired, but there was something else there, something softer than Sophie expected. "I've had the best doctors in the country," he said, voice low. "Speech therapists. Neurologists. They've all tried, for 3 years." He paused again, placing the phone down gently as if it suddenly weighed too much to hold. "But yesterday he said something. And then again this morning. Same word. Same smile." Sophie didn't speak. She didn't know what to say. Then Grant did something that caught her completely off guard. He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper, almost unsure of his own request. Would you be willing to come to the house? Just to sing that song again?" Sophie stared at him. For a second, she wondered if this was some kind of elaborate joke. But there was no smirk, no arrogance. Just a father, exhausted, humbled, and holding on to the first thread of hope he'd had in years. "I'm not a therapist," she said softly, still trying to find her footing. "I'm just a waitress." He gave a slight nod. Maybe that's exactly what he needs. Someone who sees him, not his diagnosis. The diner had fallen quiet around them. The clinking of dishes in the back faded into a soft hum, and all Sophie could hear was the echo of that little voice in her mind, "Son, again." She looked down at the business card, then back at him. She didn't ask about pay. She didn't need to know the details. Because deep down, she wasn't saying yes to the billionaire. She was saying yes to a little boy whose world had cracked open, just a sliver, because someone had dared to sing. "I'll come," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Not for the money. Just because I think he heard something in that song. And maybe I did too." The Remington estate sat on the edge of a pine-covered ridge overlooking Spokane Valley, its wide glass walls reflecting the pale sky. It was a world away from the cozy diner where Sophie first met Mason, but somehow, that same stillness followed her here. She arrived every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday morning. No guards at the gate. No contracts or strict routines. Just Sophie, her kalimba wrapped in a cloth bag, and a sense of quiet purpose she hadn't known she carried. The first few visits were simple. She sat on the living room floor, the sunlight spilling across the hardwood. Mason would sit a few feet away, legs crossed, cassette player in hand, eyes flitting between her and the floor. Sophie never pushed. She never asked him to speak or to move closer. She just played. Soft notes plucked from the kalimba filled the space like raindrops on a windowpane. Sometimes she sang familiar lullabies. Other times, she hummed tunes she made up on the spot, gentle, slow, and full of space for silence. Mason didn't speak. But he listened. And then, over time, he began to move. By the second week, he scooted an inch or two closer. He started tapping his fingers on the floor in rhythm, mimicking her pace. He would glance at her longer, let the sound soak into his skin. The cassette player still sat beside him, but he didn't cling to it the way he used to. It became just another object in the room, not a shield. On one morning in early spring, as a breeze stirred the sheer curtains, Sophie paused midway through You Are My Sunshine to sip from her glass of water. Her voice had grown dry after an hour of singing. She placed the kalimba on her lap and reached for the cup on the side table. Then she felt it. A gentle tug on her sleeve. She turned, and saw Mason beside her, eyes bright, breathing steady. His little hand was curled into the fabric of her cardigan. He didn't look scared. He didn't even hesitate. Again he said, his voice clear and purposeful. Just one word. But it echoed like a cathedral bell in Sophie's heart. She blinked, swallowing the lump rising in her throat. Okay, she whispered. Of course. What she didn't see, what Mason didn't see, was Grant standing just outside the doorway, halfway down the hall. He'd paused on his way to a meeting, phone still in hand, frozen in place as he heard that one word echo through his home. He didn't move. Didn't speak. For the first time in a long while, he let the phone drop slowly to his side. He just stood there, overwhelmed by the beauty of what he had almost missed, a connection formed not through therapy or treatment plans, but through trust, presence, and the steady healing rhythm of a lullaby.
Inside the room, Sophie resumed playing.
Mason swayed gently beside her, tapping along to the beat. He didn't say anything else, and she didn't ask him to. They didn't need more words. Because sometimes, music speaks the loudest when everything else falls quiet.
The shift happened overnight.
Sophie was wiping down the same table at Pine and Honey when she noticed her phone buzzing non-stop in the pocket of her apron. She thought it might be her sister, maybe one of the other servers switching shifts. But when she checked the screen, her heart sank. Her name, and Mason's, was trending. She tapped on a link someone had sent her. A blurry video, no more than 30 seconds, played on a gossip site. It showed Sophie seated on the rug of the Remington Estate's sun-drenched living room, kalimba in her lap, humming gently as Mason rocked beside her. The headline screamed in bold.
Mystery waitress signe la billionnairesse sont to sleep every night. Below it, the usual barrage of speculation.
Who is she? Why is she there? Is this an audition for fame, or love? The comments were worse. Some accused her of seeking attention. Others called her an opportunist. A few praised her, but it all felt invasive, like a sacred space had been cracked open and exposed to the harshest light. She didn't know the video existed. And she had no idea who had filmed it. Later that afternoon, she got the call, not from Grant himself, but from his assistant.
Kurt.
Cold. Mr. Remington has decided to suspend all further sessions with immediate effect. There's no need for a return visit. Thank you. That was it. No explanation.
No question. No chance to speak.
Grant didn't reach out. He didn't ask her if the leak had come from her. He simply vanished from contact, as though everything that had bloomed between them and Mason had been a misunderstanding, a transaction gone wrong. Sophie was stunned, but she didn't cry. Instead she went home, sat at her kitchen table, and pulled out the old cassette player Grant had handed her weeks before, the one Mason had clung to like a treasure. She had taken it home to repair the worn-down tape and replace the battery. It worked again now, good as new. She placed a fresh cassette inside, one she had recorded the night before, using the tiny mic on her laptop. It was Mason's voice. Faint but determined. Sweet but steady.
Son again, again.
His tiny voice had echoed those words over and over during their last session. She'd recorded it not for herself, but for Grant, to show him how far his son had come. It wasn't for social media. It wasn't for attention. It was proof that connection doesn't need permission to be real. Sophie didn't try to explain anything. Instead, she placed the cassette player, now repaired, clean and humming softly with that simple loop, into a brown paper bag. She wrote one word on the outside in blue ink, return. Then she walked up to the Remington gate, buzzed the intercom, and left it with a guard. No message.
No confrontation. Just the voice of a little boy, speaking into silence.
By the time the bag made it to Grant's hands, he was livid. His jaw clenched, mind clouded with betrayal. He didn't listen to the tape at first. Just stared at it. Another stunt?
Another plea?
But late that night, after the house had gone quiet and the moonlight spilled across his desk, something compelled him. He popped the cassette in. And then he heard it.
Son again, again.
A pause.
A soft log.
Then again.
Son.
Not staged. Not coached. Not manipulated. Just Mason. Grant sat in his study, unmoving, as the words repeated like a heartbeat. The tension in his chest didn't dissolve, it cracked. And in the hollow that opened, a seed of doubt was planted.
Not in Sophie.
In himself. The house had fallen into a silence heavier than any before. Days had passed since Sophie's last visit, and though Grant had resumed his daily routines, meetings, emails, late-night calls, something lingered in the corners of his home, something he couldn't name. Mason had returned to his quiet world. He no longer waited by the window at 10 a.m., kalimba in hand. He no longer pointed toward the piano in the parlor or tapped rhythmically on the edge of the coffee table. Instead, he stayed close to his room, clutching the old cassette player like it was a piece of driftwood in a stormy sea. Grant noticed. Of course, he did. But he told himself the boy would bounce back. That children are resilient. That he was doing the right thing by cutting ties with Sophie, protecting his son from the chaos of the public eye. Still, something didn't sit right. Then, on a rainy Thursday morning, the truth came to light. It started with a passing comment from a housekeeper, Trina, a woman who'd worked for the Remingtons for nearly 7 years. "I didn't think it'd blow up like that," she said casually, while arranging flowers in the foyer. "I just sent it to one guy I know at the press. Figured it was harmless."
Sweet, even.
Grant froze. "What did you say?" Trina blinked, suddenly aware she'd said too much. "The video, you know, the one of the singing. I filmed it weeks ago, on my phone. Thought people would like to see something heartwarming for once." He didn't speak. He didn't yell. He simply turned and walked away, each step growing heavier as realization settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He had blamed the wrong person. That afternoon, Grant found Mason sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the couch, holding the cassette player to his chest. The child wasn't playing it. Just holding it, close, tight, like it could shield him from something. Grant knelt beside him slowly, unsure of what he was even going to say. Then he heard it. Mason's lips moved. Barely. But the words came.
No sunshine.
Soft.
Almost inaudible.
But unmistakable.
Quietest briscogt.
He felt something inside him unravel, thread by thread, until he couldn't pretend anymore. Not about Sophie. Not about himself. And not about the way he'd handled everything. He didn't have a solution. He didn't have a plan. All he had was the weight of his own guilt, and a son who was trying to tell him that the light had gone out. Gently, Grant reached out and placed a hand on Mason's shoulder. The boy didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He just sat there, small and still. "I made the sun go away," Grant said, voice cracking for the first time in years. "Daddy did that. I'm sorry." It wasn't an apology made with grand gestures or public statements. It wasn't about fixing things with money or influence. It was just a father finally admitting his fault, to his son, and maybe to himself. Mason didn't reply. But he leaned, just slightly, into his father's touch. And in that tiny motion, Grant felt something shift. Not enough to erase the mistake, but enough to show him the road back wasn't completely gone. The community center sat tucked behind a line of maple trees, its brick exterior modest and worn, with faded murals of handprints and musical notes scattered along the walls. It was a place filled not with wealth, but with warmth. And on that sunny afternoon, it was filled with music. Grant Remington stood at the back of the multipurpose room, just inside the doorway, unsure whether he should take a step further. He wasn't used to feeling out of place, but this wasn't a boardroom or a gala. This was Sophie's world. She stood barefoot on a small mat at the front of the class, surrounded by a half-circle of children, some seated on pillows, others sprawled out on soft rugs. Kalimbas, maracas, and hand drums littered the floor. But it was her voice that filled the space, soft and radiant, weaving through the air like golden thread. She hadn't seen him yet. Grant stayed still, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the scene before him. He didn't know what he expected, resentment, maybe, or coldness. But there was only joy here. Simple, grounded joy. When the last note of the song faded, Sophie let the silence linger for a moment before clapping her hands and thanking the kids for their energy. One by one, the children wandered off toward their parents or caregivers waiting by the door. And then from the side of the room, a small voice called out, "Sophie!" Mason. He darted forward, weaving through a pile of cushions and percussion toys, arms open wide. Sophie turned just in time to catch him, crouching low as he threw his arms around her neck. She smiled, genuinely, surprised but not unready. "Hey, sunshine," she whispered, brushing a curl from his forehead. Mason pulled back, eyes gleaming with something brighter than joy, confidence. He turned to look across the room, his voice louder now, as he pointed toward his father. "Sophie, sing." Mason's smile. Daddy's smile too. Gasps rippled through the room. Then applause, tentative at first, then rising to a chorus of claps and cheers. Not because the words were perfect, but because they were his. Because they came from him. Grant didn't move at first. He stood frozen, overwhelmed by 100 feelings crashing together. But then Mason reached for him, one hand outstretched, eyes urging him forward. And so he walked. Each step felt like a mile until he reached them both. And then without a word, he knelt and wrapped his son in his arms, really truly embraced him, for the first time in Mason's life. No walls. No distance. No fear of breaking. Just a father and his son, stitched back together by a song. Later that week, at a press conference held at Remington Tower, Grant stepped onto the stage in front of a backdrop adorned with sunflowers and a soft yellow banner that read, "Sun Again Foundation, Restoring Light for Children with Communication Challenges." He adjusted the microphone, glanced once at Mason sitting in the front row beside Sophie, then looked out over the crowd of journalists and families and staff. "I've spent my life building towers," he began, voice calm and steady. "Steel and glass, concrete and numbers. I thought success meant reaching higher than everyone else." He paused, emotion catching in his throat. "But recently, a small boy taught me that the most important thing you can build is trust, is connection, is home." He looked toward Sophie, then back at the crowd. "There's a girl, just a waitress, some would say, who walked into my son's life and gave him something no amount of money could buy. Her voice. Her time. Her presence." He held up a hand, fingers slightly trembling. "I used to think I was the one who would rescue my son. But the truth is, she rescued both of us." The room was silent. Then he finished, his voice softer now. "I've built towers across this country, but she built the first home in my son's heart." And with that, the cameras flashed, not to capture a headline, but to immortalize a moment when the power of song outshone the weight of silence. If you believe that sometimes, a single song can heal the quietest corners of the heart. If today's story touched something deep within you, please take a moment to leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD for more real, heartfelt stories that remind us of the power of kindness, compassion, and connection. Thank you so much for watching until the end. We'll see you in the next story.